We are very excited to be welcoming so many people here for the SPEED Second Global SPEED Lecture of the Year. Every year we choose a country to visit through the eyes and imagination and research of historians and art historians who specialize in those countries and also happen to be great storytellers. So we're delighted to invite you tonight for our second Global SPEED Lecture on Egypt. And we're delighted because of our guest. But first of all, I want to recognize that in Louisville, of course, we might have canceled this lecture if we were back in those old days when we met in person, because our roads are still covered in snow and it's about 10 degrees. Dr. Ikram may not even have gotten here on time. But in the world of Zoom, which sometimes annoys all of us, it also brings us together, brings a giant audience like we have gathered for this lecture, and allows us to connect live with a great scholar from her home in Cairo, Egypt. So welcome tonight. For all of the things 2020 and 2021 have taken from us, they've also brought us some new gifts, and we're grateful for those tonight. I'm Stephen Riley, the director of the Speed Art Museum. And for those of you who are in Louisville or can get to Louisville easily, I want to remind you it's an exciting month for us. We're opening two major exhibits. Last week, we opened Collecting a Love Story, the glass collection of Leonard and Adele Light. This is an exhibit, the first time we've actually spread an exhibit across our museum, from the Light Gallery in our North Building to the Loft Gallery over the cinema. And it tells a story of the 69-year-old marriage and love story of Leonard and Adele Light, their love for art and artists and the speed to which they've given this globally important collection, and our deep love for them. We lost Adele a few years ago, but Leonard in his late 90s is still commissioning and collecting art. And we are so excited and grateful for an opportunity to thank him and celebrate their gift in life and beyond. This week, we're opening a second exciting exhibit on the third floor in our 9,000 square foot exhibition galleries in our new North Building, called Isabelle de Borschgrave, Fashioning Art from Paper. Isabelle de Borschgrave is a Belgian artist, and this exhibit, which pulls together 4 different exhibits she organized over time, presents her display, her interpretation of artworks over 500 years of human history, and turning the costumes in those artworks into fashion and sculptures made of paper. So whether it's Elizabeth I or the women of the French courts of Louis XV, or Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe, or Fortuny, this exhibit lets you see art in a new way, in a 3-dimensional form in paper. It's a mind-blowing exhibit. I've told this to others. Usually when people have seen an exhibit before, they're not interested in seeing it again. What I keep hearing from people is they did see this exhibit in another city and they can't wait to see it again at the Speed. It's going to open this weekend. Remember to get your time ticketing. We're still operating under safe and limited capacity, allowing 100 square feet a person in our highly air-filtered space with time ticketing and touch-free visits. Please come see both of these exhibits starting this weekend. I want to explain a quick story of how we found Dr. Salima Ikram, which was, first of all, she rises to the top of scholars in her field, but I had a specific interest about mummified animals. The Speed happens to own a mummified animal, and for a long time, it was regarded as a mummified cat. And then for many years, it was considered a fake mummified cat, meaning there was people in the business of making fake mummied animals. A few years ago, a donor helped put us in connection with an X-ray technology that allowed us to understand exactly what it was. And it turned out it was not a mummified cat, nor was it a fake mummified cat. It was a mummified ibis, which was actually a relatively common mummified animal in the tombs of Egypt. And so I said, when I wrote an email to Cairo to Dr. Ikram, I said, we're really excited to hear about your topic and your interest in mummified animals. And she's here. People love mummies of all kinds. And I'm delighted she's joining us. And I want to let you know a little bit about her. Dr. Salima Ikram is a professor of Egyptology at American University in Cairo. She's worked on several excavations in Egypt, as well as the Sudan, Greece, and Turkey. Her research interests are broad and include death, daily life, archaeozoology, the relationship between animals and humans, ethnoarchaeology, rock art, environmental history, experimental archaeology, and the preservation and presentation of cultural heritage. That's a lot. That could make up 8 or a dozen fascinating lectures on any given day. She's written several books for both adults and children, and articles with subject matters ranging from mummification to the eating habits of the ancient Egyptians. And they include with titles with incredible range of titles: Death and Burial in Ancient Egypt, Choice Cuts, Meat Production in Ancient Egypt, Divine Creatures, Animal Mummies in Ancient Egypt, and the Tomb in Ancient Egypt and the Mummy in Ancient Egypt. Tonight, Dr. Ikram's joining us from Cairo, where it's 1 a.m., with a lecture entitled May They Live Forever, Ancient Egyptian Mummies. We're delighted that she's going to help us remind us why ancient Egyptian mummies have gripped popular imagination from early times. They've been regarded as immortals, as a source of medicine, as terrifying monsters and objects of collection and curiosity. Now they're regarded as an invaluable source of information on funerary beliefs, technology, ancient diet, and the health of ancient Egyptians. This lecture explores the history of mummies in the post-Pharaonic era, as well as how the ancient Egyptians did actually mummify their dead. I'm delighted to be in Louisville. I wish I could be welcoming her with a drink and a dinner tonight in our museum, but I'm very grateful that Dr. Ikram's joining us, and I know you are too. Dr. Salima Ikram, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a great pleasure. I really wish I was there in person, but I think given the snowstorm, it's probably just as well that I'm safely in Cairo, where we are having a rainstorm, which is unusual for us. So mummies are things that have gripped popular imagination from all time. And let us hope that the curse of the mummy does not come upon us as I try to wrestle with technology and share my screen with you all. So the ancient Egyptians are famous for many things, but primarily amongst them are mummies. And you see mummies reproduced in all kinds of situations, whether it is ancient, modern, the cinema, or what have you. Mummies certainly have gripped popular imagination. And even now in the 21st century, mummies abound in films, in art, in literature. In fact, one of the most famous mummies people don't realize is the mummy of Ramses here, who was in fact the inspiration for Boris Karloff. So Ramses III was in fact the inspiration for Boris Karloff's The Mummy, and it took Karloff hours to get the makeup on and many more hours to get it off. But before we go any further, I'd like to discuss what is a mummy. What we define in Egyptology as a mummy is the artificially preserved body of a human or of any number of animals that is preserved in such a way so it basically looks like itself and can live forever. The word mummy is actually not an Egyptian word at all. It comes from Persian and Arabic, mum or mumia. And the reason that this word was associated with these preserved bodies was because mumia is either wax or bitumen or pitch or tar. And the Arabs who first encountered the mummies saw that they were covered with this black substance, and things that were made with mum or mumia became mumia themselves, and thence it went into Western languages as well. Interestingly though, this black substance that the Arabs thought was bitumen, in fact is no such thing. It is a mixture of frequently, not always, but frequently oil and resins and wax. And so when in old publications, they often call it bitumen, but that's not correct. And unless you have done your gas chromatography mass spectrometry, we like to use in Egyptology, or I like to use in Egyptology, a very technical word to describe this black mumia material. And that is black goo, because that is the scientific appropriate way of saying these things, of course. Mummies have traveled all over the world like many other Egyptian artifacts. And they have been amongst the earliest things to be exported out of Egypt. And one of the reasons that mummies made their way out of Egypt was not, as one might have thought, as an antiquity that would have been taken to a museum, but because of the fact that they have a mistaken identity. People did think that they were made with this kind of black tarry substance, bitumen, that came out of the Mummy Mountain in Persia. And in the old days, people thought that this material, this substance, was very useful for medicine and that it could be used to cure all kinds of ills. So whether you are suffering from pains in your joints or have wanted to live longer or had issues with your blood, Mumia, or bitumen, was recommended. And even now, when you go to historic pharmacies throughout the world, and the Italians and the Germans have some fantastic old pharmacies, you can still see these jars containing Mumia d'Egypti. So mummy was being used as a cure. And so people were taking mummies and grinding them up and sending this powder to Europe as a medicine. And hundreds and thousands of mummies made their way across the seas as medicine. Sometimes, and there were treatises written about, you should judge your mummy by making sure it's nicely ground, fine, and it has a nice smell. Whoever was having that hadn't probably encountered too many mummies, because the smell does vary considerably between somewhat okay to smell and absolutely awful to inhale. The fact that mummies were used as drugs made its way into literature as well. And we have Romeo and Juliet, when they went to the apothecary to buy the sort of poison or pseudo poison, one of the things that the apothecary mentions was Mummy of Egypt. So you can see that it wove its way into literature at quite an early stage and continued on from there. So hundreds and thousands of mummies did wind up in people's stomachs rather than being left buried in the ground. Of course, mummies were also the kind of thing that people wanted to take home as a souvenir. So you have bits and pieces of mummy being taken away, and they were often displayed, especially in the Victorian period, under bell jars in people's libraries. And sometimes, in fact, the people had started off when they had come to Egypt to try and buy a whole mummy, but it was so ungainly, or started to fall apart, or started to smell once it arrived in England or Europe, where the climate was much damper than it is in Egypt, so that they disarticulated the mummy and displayed bits of it. And this was also a way of getting one mummy and lots of souvenirs for everyone in your family. So they would, in fact, have false discoveries of mummies when tourists were arriving, so that A, the tourists would be excited and have something to look at, and B, then they could urge the tourists to buy these things to take home and put into their libraries, personal museums, or what have you. Mummies also suffered other ignominies. They would have been, there was this wonderful text written by a British lady who was traveling through Egypt, and she writes in her journal that it was very, very cold and they had run out of firewood. And so the guide, in fact, gave them mummies to burn because that was more plentiful than firewood. And she said, we warmed ourselves on this macabre site and boiled our tea water on it. And it did make the tea taste a trifle funny. Mark Twain, a great writer, in his Innocents Abroad, makes a bit of a joke about what the fate of mummies might be. And at least I hope it's a joke, because he said, with the steam engine, sometimes when you run out of coal or the train's going too slowly, you start stoking it with mummies and you say, these commoners are no good. Pass me a pharaoh so we can move faster. During the American Civil War, another use was found for mummies or mummy wrappings. The linen that was around them was imported by several people, first Augustus Stanhope of Maine. And this was used because, of course, there was no cotton that was easily available in the north. So what they did was they imported mummy linen and mushed it up and turned it into paper. And over here, this hymnal is written on mummy wrapping paper. And as it says here, so it's quite extraordinary. The daily production of the company mills is about £14,000. They also made brown paper out of some of the mummy wrappings and used to use it at the butcher's shops, and there was a bit of a hue and cry about that. Animal mummies were not treated much better, and these were in fact sent sometimes to England as ballast. Cat mummies came masses and masses of them, and when they got them to England, they said, well, let's sort of try and sell these off, and these were then sold also as fertilizer. And you see these sort of cartoons in Punch where people are selling off, auctioning mummies, bags and bags of mummies to sort of spread over the fields. And after a while, people found out about it and decided that they didn't want their food to be made up of dead cats or dead humans. In addition to this, we have the great unwrappings. There was a huge popularity of unwrapping mummies that took place in the 19th century. People would have brought mummies back home, found that they were, after a while, a bit disagreeable. They were starting to get moldy. And so what would happen is that the mummies would then be unwrapped with great sort of panache, and there would be champagne and canapes to follow. These mummy unwrappings became so very popular that they were also being done scientifically by some people. There was a doctor, Mummy Pedigree, who was called after a while. He used to do mummy unwrappings. He was a friend of the great explorer and archaeologist Belzoni. And Belzoni gave Pettigrew a few mummies, and Pettigrew decided that he was going to unwrap them and study them and learn about the ancient Egyptians' health and disease and so forth. And he got very much fascinated by this. And one of the first scientific works on mummification was written by Thomas Pettigrew. Pettigrew then, people heard about this and they started to come and watch and so on. And then it became a bit of a public spectacle. And Pettigrew started selling tickets, and he used to do this in the Charing Cross big hospital in the operating theatre, and people would come and observe while he unwrapped mummies. And this was so popular that it was always sold out, and he needed an endless supply of mummies. And the Archbishop of Canterbury was once turned away because there was no room. And so he, luckily for him, had a command performance and had the Pettigrew and the mummies come to Canterbury for an unwrapping. Pettigrew's work became so well known, and people became increasingly in the 19th century fascinated by mummification, that Alexander, Duke of Hamilton, decided that he wanted to be mummified, and he, in his will, wrote that Pettigrew should come and mummify him. And Pettigrew, in fact, did this, and sadly for us, he left no notes, though Aidan Dodson and I once tried to approach the heirs of the Duke of Hamilton, and then Aidan tried it again with someone else. But unfortunately, for some peculiar reason, they did not want their ancestor disinterred from his eternal rest in a very nice sarcophagus. So we don't know how successful Pettigrew's experiments were. And here you can see people doing mummy unwrappings and enjoying themselves tremendously. Sometimes it was science and sometimes it was just parlor entertainment. While all of this was going on, the question is, what were the archaeologists doing? Were they paying any attention to mummies or not? By and large, human remains were not understood as being that important in the earliest days of archaeology. Mummies were regarded as artifacts and curiosities to be examined as a manifestation of the curious religious funerary practices of the ancient Egyptians. But looking at mummies and looking at bodies in particular was not always something that people focused on. Now, one of the few exceptions to this is William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who was one of the great archaeologists in Egypt. Petrie was excavating at Abydos, a major site in Egypt, and there he found an arm wedged into the wall of a royal tomb belonging to King Jer. And this tomb had been regarded as possibly the burial place. This is by later Egyptians. They'd forgotten that King Jer was there, and they thought that this was the burial place of the god Osiris. More on him later. So this was a place filled with reverence. There was a huge cult there. And there was this arm that probably they thought originally had belonged to Osiris, but was belonging to King Jer. And we know it belongs to Jer, or possibly some of his family members, but most likely King Jer. It's because he's got the first ever ID bracelet on his arm, where his name is written in these serechs. The ancient Egyptians invented everything. So Petrie very carefully wrapped up this arm, took notes, and sent it off to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. There it was received by Emile Brugsch. Brugsch looked at this arm and said, yeah, well, lots of really nice bracelets. So he took off the bandaging apparently, took out the bracelets, put them on display, and quite possibly got rid of that arm because no one's seen it since, which is highly ironic because later on, Brugsch became quite involved with mummies and examining them, unwrapping them, photographing them, and documenting them. One only wishes that he had paid that attention to one of the earliest royal mummies of Egypt.
Thank you so much, Salima. This was truly incredible, and I think we could answer questions all night. They continue to pour into the chat. This was just absolutely fascinating, and we're so grateful not only for you joining us, but for you joining us at 1 in the morning to give such a lively presentation. For those of you that are interested in our continued Global Speed lecture series, we will have another talk on April 20th at 6 p.m. With Kara Cooney, who is a professor of Egyptian art and architecture at UCLA. And we'll put the link in the chat so that you all can go ahead and register for that, and hope that you'll join us for that. And we also have 2 exciting lectures coming up with artists whose glass work is featured in Collecting a Love Story Glass from the Adele and Leonard Light collection. So we'll be featuring Shay Rhodes on March 9th. And Beth Lippman on May 11th, both wonderful contemporary glass artists. And those will be free and open to the public, and we hope that you all will join us for those as well. I hope you'll all join me again in thanking Salima for joining the Speed tonight. This was truly wonderful, and hope you all have a great evening.